A ledger lay open on a plank counter, and beside the gold dust entries, a clerk wrote a price for a woman standing 3 feet away, as if she could not hear the ink scratch her worth into the page. Silas Dunmore had carried her contract from San Francisco to a mining camp on the Middle Fork, and by noon he meant to sell what remained of it to whichever man in Widow's Bar offered the most dust. She had a name. Nobody in that room had asked for it yet. They called the bidding fair. Men who had not looked twice at a woman in a year leaned against the claim office wall and threw numbers into the air like they were buying a mule or a crate of nails. One man did not bid at all. He watched the way her hands stayed folded and still while the room around her came apart. And when the price finally climbed past what any of them could pay outright, he stepped forward and laid down gold enough to end the auction before it truly began. He paid in full, not the customary third down the others offered, and Silas Dunmore's smile thinned into something closer to alarm. Then, in front of every miner, merchant, and churchwife who had come to watch a woman sold like stock, Josiah Hale took the contract from the clerk's hand and tore it down the middle. The paper meant she was owned. Without it, the camp had no name for what she was instead, and that question would follow both of them into the winter. Her name was Lam Wing Yi, and she had crossed an ocean owing a debt she never signed her own name to. She did not know yet that tearing the paper solved nothing, that a woman with no contract in a camp built on paper was a woman anyone could claim. She only knew that, for the first time since the ship left Guangzhou, a stranger had looked at her and asked quietly, in broken words he'd clearly practiced, what should he call her? The stagecoach climbed out of the foothills for 6 days before the pines closed in, and the road narrowed to a rutted scar between granite walls. And Lam Wing Yi spent every one of those days memorizing the shape of a debt she had not created. Her father had died owing $400 in passage money to a broker in the flower boat quarter of Guangzhou, a debt her older brother could not pay and would not speak of, and so it had passed to her the way a family passes down a name, without asking whether she wanted it. Silas Dunmore rode across from her, a compact man in a good coat who checked his pocket watch more often than he checked the road, and every time he caught her looking at him, he smiled in a way that made her wish she had a knife instead of a hairpin sewn into her sleeve. She had wrapped the jade in red silk before she left her mother's house, the last soft thing in a trunk full of hard ones, and she touched it now, the way another woman might touch a rosary. Outside the window, the land kept climbing, pine giving way to cedar, cedar giving way to bare granite scarred silver by the pickaxes of men who had come here believing the mountains owed them something. Smoke rose from a dozen camps before she saw the first one clearly. A scatter of canvas and raw lumber pressed against a bend in a river the color of weak tea. Sluice boxes stacked along the bank like the ribs of some enormous animal. Dunmore had told her the name of the place twice, as if she were slow rather than simply choosing not to answer him in his own language before she had to. Widow's Bar. She turned the English syllables over privately, the way she had turned over every word he'd taught her on the crossing, storing them like coins she did not yet know the value of. A boy ran alongside the coach for a stretch, barefoot and thin, shouting something to the driver that made the other passengers laugh, and Wing Yi understood only that the sound of it was cruel before she understood the words themselves, months later, long after it stopped mattering. When the coach finally stopped, dust hung in the air thick enough to taste, gold-colored and gritty, and every man within sight of the road turned to look, not at the coach, not at Dunmore counting his cases, but at her, standing on the step in a traveling dress gone gray with 3 weeks of road, holding a trunk she would not let the driver carry. She did not look back at any of them. She looked instead for the mountains behind the camp, green and vast and entirely indifferent to what was about to happen to her beneath them, and found in that indifference something almost like comfort. By the time Dunmore had her trunk carried to the claim office, half of Widow's Bar had found a reason to be standing in the street. Miners who had not washed the color of the earth from their hands in a week leaned in doorways with an unhurried, cataloging kind of attention, the same look Wing Yi had seen men give horses at a fair outside Canton, and she made herself stand straight under it because her mother had taught her that a bent back invited more than it protected. A woman in a starched collar crossed to the other side of the street rather than pass close to her, pulling a boy by the wrist so hard he stumbled, and somewhere behind her, 2 men laughed at something involving the words celestial and pigtail that she did not yet have full English for, though she understood enough of the shape of the laughter to know it was not kind. Dunmore walked ahead of her without offering his arm, the way he might walk ahead of a horse he was leading to sail, calling out names of men he apparently knew: a storekeeper, a barber, a man he called Judge, though there was no courthouse for 100 miles. Through the shifting crowd she caught, for perhaps 3 seconds, a man standing apart near the claim office porch who was not looking at her the way the others were. He was tall in the unhurried way of someone who had stopped noticing his own height. Sleeves rolled to the elbow over forearms burned the color of the road. And he was not smiling, and he was not laughing at Dunmore's words, and he was not, she realized with something between relief and suspicion, looking at her body at all. He was looking at her hands, which she had folded tightly at her waist, the way one might look at a bird's wings to guess whether it could fly. Then the crowd closed again, and he was gone, and a heavy-set man in a claims office apron, she would learn his name was Pruitt before the hour was out, stepped down to meet Dunmore with a ledger already open under his arm. Dunmore said something to him, low and fast, and Pruitt's eyes moved over her the way they might move over a crate marked fragile, assessing not her face but her wrists, her back, the set of her shoulders, weighing her the way the camp weighed everything, in dust, in ounces, in what a thing could be made to do. Somewhere under the noise of the street, she heard a phrase in her own tongue rise unbidden in her chest, the one her mother used to say before anything difficult: Sai Gao, do not be afraid. She did not know yet whether it would be true. Inside, the claim office smelled of tallow and cold iron and the mineral tang of gold dust that had been weighed on the same scale for 3 years without anyone thinking to clean it, and Otis Pruitt set his ledger on the counter beside that scale, as though the two belonged to the same category of business. He asked Dunmore for her name first, not her, and when Dunmore gave the surname wrong, Lynn instead of Lamb, a mistake made from carelessness rather than cruelty, which somehow made it worse, Pruitt wrote it down without checking, because to check, he would have had to speak to her directly and address her as a source of information, rather than an object about which information was supplied. Wing Yi opened her mouth to correct him in the careful English she had practiced on the crossing, and found, for the first time since Sacramento, that no one in the room was waiting to hear it. Pruitt asked her age. Dunmore guessed. Pruitt asked what she could do, and Dunmore listed cooking, laundry, and mending as though reading off the qualities of a plow horse, leaving out entirely that she could read 400 characters and keep a household ledger, and had, before her father's debts swallowed the family shop, kept the accounts for 11 employees without an error the tax collector ever found. When Pruitt asked what to call her for the camp role, since Lam Wing Yi was, in his words, a mouthful for men with no Chinese in them, Dunmore said simply, China Mary. It was what they called the last one, easier for everybody. Pruitt wrote it down beside a column of gold assay figures, her worth and the week's dust entered in the same neat, patient hand, and for a moment, Wing Yi watched her invented name settle onto the page and thought that a person could survive almost anything except being asked to answer to a word that was never hers. A fly circled the tallow candle on the counter. Outside, someone was hammering a new sign onto the assay office door, the strokes falling in a rhythm that matched absurdly the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She thought of her mother's voice reading ledgers aloud in the lamp-lit back room of the shop in Guangzhou, correcting her daughter's brushstrokes with the flat of one finger, never once raising her voice. And she understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that the woman being registered on this page did not exist, had never existed, and that whatever happened next would happen to a name with no person behind it. Which meant, she thought, gripping the hairpin through the cloth of her sleeve, that the real one was still hers to keep hidden. By afternoon, the news had traveled the length of the camp, faster than the stage itself had traveled the mountain road, carried porch to porch, the way news always moved, in a place with no newspaper and too much idle time between shifts at the rocker box. Dunmore stood on the claim office steps and told it plainly to whoever gathered, embellishing nothing because the truth was already lurid enough to hold an audience. A debt from her father, a passage bought on credit, a contract of service he was authorized to sell to recover his costs, $400 and change, take it or leave it, gentlemen, and the bidding to begin at sundown when the shifts let out and a man could see what he was buying by lamplight same as daylight. Wing Yi stood to one side of the steps where Dunmore had positioned her, hands folded, chin level, refusing the men who studied her the satisfaction of seeing her look away first, though inside her, the humiliation sat like a stone swallowed whole, heavy and undigested, and entirely private. A churchwoman in a gray bonnet paused long enough to say, not unkindly but not to her either, that it was a mercy the girl would have honest work and a roof, as though laundry performed under threat of sale were a kindness rather than its opposite, and Wing Yi understood every word of it and answered none of it, because she had learned on the ship that silence, correctly worn, could look like composure instead of the surrender it sometimes was. A boy of perhaps 8, thin through the shoulders in a shirt clearly cut down from a man's, stood at the edge of the crowd, staring at her with the frank, unguarded curiosity children have, before someone teaches them not to, and when she met his eyes, she did not look away from him, the way she had looked away from the men. He was the first person in Widow's Bar to look at her face and nothing else. Somewhere past the crowd, at the edge of her vision, she caught the tall man from the porch again, arms crossed now, listening to Dunmore's pitch with an expression she could not yet read, and she found herself wondering, foolishly she told herself, uselessly, what a man like that thought was fair to buy, and what he thought was not, and whether by sundown it would matter to her at all. Sundown brought the whole camp down off the hillside, claims in a loose dust-colored river of men still wet at the collar from washing the day's dirt off their hands. And by the time Pruitt set his scale on a barrel outside the claim office to serve as an auctioneer's stand, there were more men crowded into the street than Wing Yi had seen assembled anywhere since the docks at Hong Kong. Dunmore opened the bidding low, a formality, and the numbers that followed came fast and ugly, punctuated by laughter that had nothing gentle in it. A man offered $10 and a jug of something homemade. Another offered to trade a mule outright. A third, older and missing most of his teeth, said loudly enough for the whole street to hear that he'd pay double if the terms of service included more than cooking, and the crowd around him laughed the particular laugh of men who had decided a woman standing in front of them could not understand what was being said about her body, when in fact she understood every word and simply had nowhere on earth to put the understanding except deeper inside herself. She kept her eyes on a fixed point past the crowd, a pine at the edge of the clearing, black against a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, and breathed the way her mother had taught her to breathe through pain that could not be stopped, only outlasted. Near the porch, Josiah Hale had not spoken since the bidding opened, arms still crossed, jaw set in a way one of the men beside him, an older partner named Amos Whitcomb, would later describe as the look Josiah got right before he did something none of them expected. Twice Amos murmured something to him, and twice Josiah did not answer, watching instead the way the toothless man's bid climbed and the way Wing Yi's shoulders did not move even a fraction under the weight of it, as though she had trained her whole body to refuse them a single visible reaction. Dunmore, sensing the bidding stalling below, what he'd hoped to clear, raised his voice and reminded the crowd that a woman like this, literate, he added, as though it were a novelty rather than the truth, capable, quiet, was worth a premium over what they'd have paid for rough labor. And somewhere in the crowd, a man muttered that quiet just meant she hadn't learned English yet to argue, and the crowd laughed again, and it was into that laugh, precisely, that Josiah Hale finally stepped forward. He did not raise his voice the way the others had, and that alone was enough to quiet a portion of the street, because a man who does not need volume to be heard is a different kind of animal than the ones who had been shouting numbers for the better part of 10 minutes. Josiah named a figure that ended the bidding outright, more than double the toothless man's highest offer, more than Dunmore had allowed himself to hope for in a camp this small. And then, before Pruitt could even finish writing it down, he reached into his coat and counted the full amount onto the scale barrel, in dust and coin both, refusing the customary third down that let a buyer walk a debt for months, the way most men here bought everything from lumber to livestock. Dunmore's smile, which had been aimed at the crowd all evening, thinned considerably as he recounted the sum twice to be sure it was real, because a man paid in full owned outright, with no further claim for Dunmore to hold over anyone. And that had clearly not been part of his arithmetic. A murmur went through the street, some admiring, some resentful. One man loudly wondering aloud what Hale wanted a Chinese girl for, that a mule wouldn't do cheaper. But Josiah did not answer any of them either. He walked instead the short distance to where Wing Yi stood, close enough that she had to tip her chin slightly to meet his eyes, and for a moment that stretched longer than either of them likely intended. Neither spoke. Every man in that street was watching to see what he would do with what he'd bought. What he did was take off his hat. It was such a small, ordinary gesture, the kind any man might make entering a church or greeting an equal, that half the crowd didn't register it as anything at all. But Wing Yi felt something in her chest come loose for the first time since Sacramento. In English roughened by disuse and care both, he asked her not what she could cook or what she could mend, but what her mother had called her, the actual sounds of it. So he wouldn't get it wrong the way Pruitt's ledger already had, she told him, Wing Yi. He said it back slowly, imperfectly, and did not once in getting it wrong the first time and asking her to say it again. Make her feel foolish for correcting him, which was, she would understand only much later, the exact moment the auction stopped being the worst thing that had happened to her that day. Pruitt produced the contract from Dunmore's case, a single folded sheet, her father's debt translated into English legal language neither of them had fully explained to her, $400 and the terms of a service that had never once used the word freedom in either direction, and held it out for Josiah to sign as the new party of record, the way a man might sign for a claim or a mule. Josiah took it, unfolded it once, read it slowly enough that Dunmore's smile began to falter again, and then, without a word of explanation to Pruitt or the crowd, or Dunmore, or even to Wing Yi herself, tore it straight down the middle and then again crosswise, until what had been a legal instrument controlling a human being was 4 ragged quarters drifting to the mud at his boots. The street went silent in a different register than it had been silent for the bidding. This was the silence of men recalculating, on the spot, what kind of man had just spent a fortune in dust and then destroyed the paper that proved he owned what he'd bought it for. Dunmore recovered his voice first, and it came out sharper than his selling voice, warning that, without a contract of record, there was no legal standing for her presence in the camp at all. Not as an employee, not as a ward, not as anything the law in this county recognized, which meant, he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear it as a threat rather than a caution, that she was now nobody's responsibility, and a woman who is nobody's responsibility in a mining camp is a woman anybody can claim right back off the street the moment her protector's back is turned. Josiah did not look at Dunmore when he answered. He looked at Wing Yi, standing amid the torn paper with an expression she would spend the following weeks trying to name, and said only that he'd figure the rest of it out, the way a man says a thing he believes more than he's certain of it. Wing Yi looked down at the scraps in the mud, her name spelled wrong on every fragment, her worth reduced to numbers now torn beyond reading, and felt, underneath the relief of the auction ending, a colder understanding settle in alongside it. The paper had been cruel, but it had also, in its cruelty, been proof. Without it, she was free in exactly the way a boat is free once it's cut loose from the dock, unowned, and also, for the first time in this country, entirely unanchored. He carried her trunk himself the quarter-mile up the slope to his claim, which surprised her more than the tearing of the contract had, because in 3 weeks of travel with Dunmore, no man had once offered to carry anything of hers, and she found herself watching his back the whole way up the trail, trying to decide whether the gesture meant what it seemed to mean, or whether she simply did not yet know enough about this country to read it correctly. The cabin, when they reached it, was smaller than the shop back home, and cruder in every visible way. Raw plank walls, a stone hearth built by hands more determined than skilled, a single window with paper instead of glass. But it was clean in the manner of a man who lived alone and had nothing to be ashamed of hiding, and she noted that with the same careful attention she'd once given a household's ledgers, filing it as evidence for a judgment she had not yet allowed herself to make. Amos Whitcomb met them at the door of the second, smaller cabin nearby, wiping his hands on a rag, and studied Wing Yi for a long moment before saying only that Josiah had never once in 4 years of partnership done a single thing without a reason, even when the reason took him a while to explain to the rest of them, which was, she understood, meant as reassurance, though it landed more as warning. That first evening, Josiah showed her where things were kept, speaking slowly and pointing, and she answered in the fragments of English she had, good, fire, tomorrow, testing each word for whether it fit before she committed her voice to it. Aware that a woman who spoke badly in this camp would be laughed at twice as hard as one who spoke well, she did not tell him about the hairpin. She unwrapped it from its scrap of red silk, only after he'd gone out to check the sluice gate in the last blue light, turning the jade over in her palm at the small table, tracing the carved plum blossom her mother had chosen. Because it bloomed, her mother said, exactly when the cold was worst. Gam San, her father had called this country before he died, still owing for the crossing that would eventually cost his daughter her name, the Gold Mountain, a promise made of dust and distance neither of them had ever seen. She wrapped the hairpin again and hid it beneath the trunk's false bottom, not because she distrusted the quiet, unhurried man outside checking his water gate by lamplight, but because she had learned at considerable cost exactly how quickly a country could take a thing that was hers and rename it something else. Within a week, Wing Yi had reorganized Josiah's kitchen shelf by a logic he had never once applied to it himself. Sawed away from the damp wall, dried beans behind glass rather than open sacking that drew mice. The good knife kept honed instead of left to dull in a drawer. And though he said nothing about any of it directly, she noticed he stopped losing things he used to swear about losing, which she took, privately, as the closest thing to gratitude a man like him seemed able to offer out loud. She was learning English the way she had once learned bookkeeping, methodically, building a private ledger of words in the back of her mind, and testing each one aloud only after she was reasonably certain of its shape, so that her sentences came out slower than her thoughts, but rarely wrong, a habit that made the camp's assumption of her ignorance almost comic to her, though she was careful never to let the comedy show on her face where anyone could use it against her. Not every door in Widow's Bar opened to her the way the kitchen shelf had. The general store's proprietor, a narrow man named Cutter, who had bid on her at the auction and lost, made a habit of serving every customer ahead of her, regardless of who had arrived first. And the laundry line behind the boarding house went quiet in the particular way conversation goes quiet when the people in it have just been discussing the person walking past. Josiah noticed none of this the first several times it happened, not from indifference but from the ordinary blindness of a man who had never once in his life had to calculate whether a room was safe to enter. And Wing Yi found she did not yet have the English, or perhaps the trust, to explain it to him plainly, so she simply adjusted her own routes through camp instead, the way water finds the low ground around a rock rather than arguing with it. Amos, sharper-eyed than his partner in these particular matters, caught her once circling wide around the store rather than pass close to Cutter's porch, and said nothing to her about it directly either, but that evening he mentioned to Josiah, apparently offhand, that a man ought to walk his own woman to the store himself now and again, just to remind the camp whose claim she stood on, and Wing Yi, pretending not to understand English well enough to have followed the remark, filed it away instead, as the second piece of evidence in a judgment still very much unfinished. The boy who had stared at her without flinching on the day of the auction turned out to belong to the camp's laundress, a widow named Hetty Reed, who took in washing from half the claims on the bar and raised her son Tobias largely on the porch behind the wash house while she worked. And it was Tobias who first crossed the distance between Wing Yi and the rest of Widow's Bar, arriving at Josiah's cabin one afternoon, with no more introduction than holding up a slingshot he'd carved badly and asking, with the total unself-consciousness of an 8-year-old, whether she could fix the fork of it so it wouldn't split. She could. She did in about the time it took him to sit down on the step and watch her hands work. And in exchange, he taught her, without either of them quite deciding to make it a lesson, the correct English word for a dozen things around the claim she'd been guessing at: auger, whetstone, gully, accepting her mangled pronunciation of each one back to him without a trace of the mockery grown men in camp seemed to require. He came back the next day, and the one after that, until his visit settled into something like a routine that Hetty Reed, watching from the washhouse yard, did not discourage, though she never quite came close enough herself to be called friendly. It was Tobias who mentioned, almost as an aside while whittling on the cabin steps, that his mother had been feeling poorly the last few days, feverish in the evenings and too tired by dark to finish the ironing, and that Doc Cobb had said it was nothing, just camp air and overwork, the kind of thing that went around every fall when the nights turned cold and the river ran low. Wing Yi filed the detail away without comment, the way she filed most things in this camp. But that night, unpacking her trunk for a length of cloth, her hand found the small paper packets tucked beneath the false bottom, alongside the hairpin. Dried ginger, dried mugwort, a few other roots her mother had pressed into her hands at the dock, with instructions she had only half believed she would ever need this far from home. And she left them exactly where they were, not yet certain whether this camp would let her use them, even if the need came. By the second week of the cold snap, what Doc Cobb had called overwork had a dozen names in camp, and none of them were kind. Camp Ague, the Shakes, the Bar Fever. And it moved through Widow's Bar the way fire moves through dry grass, indifferent to whether it found a claim owner or a laundress first. Hetty Reed took to her bed on a Tuesday with a fever that would not break, and by Friday, 3 more households along the bar were shuttered against visitors, and by the following Monday, Amos Whitcomb himself, a man who had outlasted 2 previous outbreaks and considered himself made of sturdier stuff than most, woke shaking so badly he couldn't hold a coffee cup steady, and Josiah moved him from his own cabin into the main house so someone could watch him through the worst of the nights. Doc Cobb did what he knew, bleeding some patients, dosing others with quinine bark boiled strong enough to blacken a spoon, keeping the sick rooms shuttered against what he insisted was bad night air. And for those with the mildest cases it seemed perhaps to help, though it was just as likely they would have recovered regardless. For the worst cases, Tobias's mother among them, nothing Cobb tried moved the fever an inch. And by the second week of illness, the washhouse yard had gone entirely quiet, the boy sitting alone on the step where he used to whittle, no longer coming to the cabin because there was no one to walk him there and nothing in him left over for slingshots. Wing Yi watched Amos through the cabin's thin partition wall those nights, listening to the particular rattle in his breathing that she recognized with a cold, sinking certainty from another sick room half a world away. Her grandmother's, the winter Wing Yi turned 12, when the same fever had moved through their street in Guangzhou, and her mother, refusing to leave any of it to chance or to foreign remedies newly fashionable among the wealthier families, had treated every case in the household herself with what she called old knowledge, and lost not one patient the doctors down the street had not already written off first. Josiah asked Doc Cobb directly on the 4th sleepless night whether there was anything else to try, and Cobb, gray with his own exhaustion, admitted there was not. That quinine and bleeding and shuttered windows were the whole of what medicine offered a man this far from a real hospital, and that some would recover, and some, God help them, would not. And there was no more science in guessing which than in a coin toss. That night, after Cobb had gone home to sleep for the first time in 2 days, Wing Yi sat by Amos's bed alone and studied him the way her mother had taught her to study a patient. Not just the fever, but the color under the nails, the dryness of the tongue, the particular shallow catch at the top of each breath, and every sign matched a sickness her mother had named and treated a dozen times over. Ginger and mugwort, steeped strong and taken hot. A compress of the same herbs bound warm against the chest to loosen what the fever had tightened. A regimen that had nothing whatsoever to do with bleeding a man already weak from days without food. She went to the trunk and unpacked the false bottom fully for the first time since the crossing, laying the paper packets out on the small table by lamplight, and found her hands were not entirely steady, not from doubt about the medicine, but from doubt about everything around it. What happened to a Chinese woman in an American mining camp who treated a white man without a license, without permission, without Cobb's blessing, if the treatment failed? She had already been called China Mary once for the sin of existing in this camp. She did not need to imagine very hard what they would call her if Amos Whitcomb died with her herbs on his chest, instead of Cobb's quinine in his blood. Josiah found her still sitting there near midnight, herbs untouched on the table, and asked what was wrong in a voice too tired to hide the fear underneath it. And for a long moment, Wing Yi said nothing at all, weighing a decision that felt, in that lamplit room, considerably larger than it likely was. Whether to hand this quiet, unhurried man the one piece of proof that she was more than what Dunmore's ledger had made her, or to fold the packets away again and let Cobb's method run its uncertain course, safe in her invisibility a while longer. She thought of her mother's hands moving certain and unafraid over her grandmother's sickbed, while neighbors whispered outside the door, and of Tobias sitting alone now on a step where no one came to sit with him. Then she picked up the ginger. She told Josiah plainly, in English, that had grown steadier over the weeks, precisely because this moment demanded it be steady, that she believed she could help Amos, and that she needed hot water, a clean cloth, and his trust for one night before Cobb returned to argue her out of it. And Josiah, who had already tried everything the camp doctor knew and watched it do nothing, said only, "Do it," and went to build up the fire himself, rather than ask her a single question she might not yet have the words to answer. She steeped the ginger and mugwort together until the cabin filled with a smell nothing in Widow's Bar had ever held before, sharp and green and entirely foreign, and got Amos to drink what he could hold down between the worst of the shaking, then bound the warm, spent herbs in cloth against his chest, the way her mother's hands had moved 100 times in that back room in Guangzhou, patient and exact, not a single motion wasted on hope that wasn't earned by care. Cobb, arriving at dawn to check on his patient, found the room smelling of something he couldn't name, and his instructions entirely disregarded, and the argument that followed was loud enough that Tobias, walking past on his way to sit alone again on the washhouse step, stopped to listen through the cabin wall. Cobb called it quackery. He called it dangerous, unproven, the kind of foreign folk remedy that had no business anywhere near a dying man, and demanded Josiah put a stop to it before it did real harm on top of what the fever was already doing. Josiah, who had spent 4 sleepless nights watching his oldest friend get worse under Cobb's proven methods, said only that Amos's breathing had eased for the first time since Tuesday, and that he intended to see whether it kept easing before he stopped anything at all. It was, Wing Yi understood later, the second time in a month this man had chosen her word over the entire weight of the camp's expectation, and the second time he had done it not because he trusted her blindly, but because he had watched the results with his own eyes and judged accordingly, which was, she thought, turning the thought over carefully, the way she turned the jade hairpin. A different and more durable kind of trust than the first. Outside, Tobias had heard enough through the wall to understand that someone, finally, was trying something for his mother too. And by mid-morning, he was standing at the cabin door, asking in a voice gone thin with days of fear whether the same medicine might work for Hetty. By that evening, Amos's fever had broken enough that he could sit propped against the wall and take broth without Josiah having to hold the cup for him, and Wing Yi, exhausted in a way that felt clean rather than defeated, walked with Tobias down to the washhouse to do for his mother what she had just done for a stranger, steeping a second batch of the herbs by Hetty's own hearth, while the boy sat close enough to touch his mother's hand, and watched Wing Yi's face for any sign of how bad it truly was. Hetty's fever took 3 more days to break fully, longer than Amos's had, but it broke, and by the end of that week, 2 other households along the bar, who had heard how it went, sent word asking, cautiously, whether the Chinese woman might come and try the same thing for them, framing the request as though it were Josiah's medicine rather than hers, which she noticed and did not correct, because a request that traveled under his name traveled faster through this camp than the same request would have traveled under her own. Doc Cobb, to his credit, came around to something short of an apology within the week, admitting to Josiah over coffee that whatever she'd used had done more for the breathing than anything in his own bag, and asking, with genuine if grudging curiosity, what exactly the plants were called. A question Wing Yi answered fully and precisely, in the careful, unhurried English of someone who had waited a long time to be asked a real question about her own knowledge rather than her own price. Not every voice in Widow's Bar turned so easily. In the general store, Cutter told anyone who'd listen that it was a strange kind of luck that every patient the celestial woman touched happened to live, and a stranger kind still that nobody had thought to ask what exactly was in those foreign herbs she was feeding to half the camp's sickbeds, and a churchwoman who had lost her own sister to the fever 2 winters back was overheard saying in a voice not quite low enough that there was a difference between medicine and witchcraft, and she wasn't yet convinced which one this was. Wing Yi heard about the remark from Tobias, who repeated it to her with the flat, uncomprehending honesty of a child, too young to understand why the words that had saved his mother's life were making some of the adults around him afraid instead of grateful. The fever had not touched every claim on the bar equally kindly, and by the time it finally burned itself out with the first real snow of the season, 3 men and 1 elderly widow had died, despite every remedy tried on them, Cobb's and Wing Yi's alike, and grief in a small camp with no church and no doctor's diploma worth trusting looked, more often than anyone liked to admit, for somewhere to land besides simple bad luck. It found her. A rumor began, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, that the households the Chinese woman had treated had recovered and the households she hadn't touched had died, as though that pattern proved something sinister about her methods rather than the far simpler truth that Cobb had asked her only to the sick rooms, whose own doctor had already run out of ideas, and within 2 weeks of Amos's recovery, the word witch had been spoken aloud in the general store, loudly enough that Josiah heard about it from 3 separate men before the day was through. It was into this particular unease, sharp-eyed as ever, that Silas Dunmore rode back into Widow's Bar in early winter, ostensibly to collect on a debt in the next camp over, but staying considerably longer than that errand required, once he heard what the season had done to local opinion of the woman he'd once sold at auction. He found Pruitt first, not Josiah, and reminded him, accurately, which was the worst part, that no legal contract of employment, guardianship, or marriage had ever been filed for Lam Wing Yi since the one he had witnessed torn to pieces in this very street, which meant that in the strict eyes of the county she remained, technically, an unclaimed foreign national residing on a man's claim without any standing whatsoever, a situation Dunmore was prepared to remedy for a fee by arranging her transport to a camp 2 counties over, where a broker he knew was still short of domestic labor and considerably less picky about rumors of witchcraft. Pruitt, who had disliked the whole arrangement from the start, and disliked being reminded of his own sloppy paperwork even more, admitted the point stood. There was, on the county's books, no legitimate reason Wing Yi could not simply be walked out of Widow's Bar by whoever produced her original bill of sale, torn or not, and no legitimate reason for Josiah to stop it either. Short of violence he could ill afford to commit against a man with a lawyer in Sacramento. Word of Dunmore's return reached the cabin before Dunmore himself did, carried by Amos, who had heard it from Pruitt directly, and walked up the slope at a pace considerably faster than his lungs had managed since the fever, arriving winded and furious and demanding to know what in God's name Josiah intended to do about a man who meant to walk Wing Yi off the claim on a paperwork technicality after everything she'd done for this camp's sick rooms. Josiah's answer was to send for Sheriff Boone, the nearest thing Widow's Bar had to county law, a slow-speaking, careful man who arrived the next morning and confirmed, to no one's relief, that Dunmore's reading of the situation was technically sound. A torn contract left no legal instrument behind it, and without a marriage license, an indenture, or some other filed paper, the county had no standing to recognize Wing Yi's residence on the claim as anything but a private arrangement Dunmore was, strictly speaking, within his rights to contest, though Boone made it plain he had no personal appetite for enforcing it, and would take his time about the paperwork if it came to that. That evening, for the first time since the night she'd unwrapped it at the small table, Wing Yi took the jade hairpin out in front of Josiah, turning it in the lamplight so he could see the plum blossom carved into it, and told him, in the fullest English she had yet spoken to him, the whole of what it was, her mother's, and her mother's mother's before that. The only object in her trunk with no price Dunmore had ever thought to write into a ledger, because he had never known it existed, proof of a lineage no camp official could dispute, even if they refused to recognize the woman carrying it. It is not a marriage paper, she told him, but it is the only true thing I own, and if this camp needs paper to believe I am a person and not a debt, then let them make new paper, because I will not be sold twice for the crime of surviving the first time. Josiah looked at the hairpin a long moment, and then at her, and said that he had already been meaning to ask Boone a question he'd been putting off since the night of the auction, and that Dunmore, whatever he thought he was owed, was about to find out exactly how wrong he'd been about what tearing that first paper had actually cost him. Boone called the meeting at the claim office itself, the same porch where the auction had been held, because a decision about a person's standing in this county deserved, he said, at least as much daylight as the sale had gotten, and by the appointed hour, the whole of Widow's Bar had turned out again. Not to watch a woman sold this time, but to watch, whether they fully understood it yet or not, whether the camp intended to let one be taken back. Dunmore made his case first, brisk and legal, citing the torn contract and the absence of any filed instrument since, and Pruitt, standing beside his ledger with visible discomfort, confirmed the bare facts of the paperwork because the facts, unfortunately, were on Dunmore's side. Then Amos Whitcomb stood up from the bench where he was still recovering his strength and said, in front of the whole street, that he owed his life to the woman Dunmore wanted, walked out of camp on a technicality, and that any man who called that witchcraft could say so to his face instead of behind a store counter. Hetty Reed, thin still from her own illness, but standing on her own 2 feet, said much the same, with Tobias gripping her hand tight enough that his knuckles had gone white, and one after another, 3 more households, whose sick rooms Wing Yi had sat in through the worst of the fever, stood and said, in their own plain words, that whatever the county's paperwork said, the camp's own eyes had already settled the question of what kind of woman she was. Cutter tried once to raise the old talk of foreign remedies and unproven medicine, and was answered so quickly and so thoroughly by half the street that he did not try again. When the crowd had said its piece, Josiah stepped forward, not toward Dunmore, but toward Wing Yi, standing near the same spot on the porch where she'd stood the night of the auction with her chin level and her hands folded, refusing then, as now, to look away first, and said that he did not intend to argue paperwork with Dunmore because paperwork had never been the point, that he'd torn the first contract because no piece of paper should ever say a person belonged to another person, and that the only paper he was willing to sign now was one that said the opposite, that he was asking her, in front of the whole camp, so there could be no more argument from Dunmore or anyone else about her standing here, to marry him, not as a purchase but as a choice, hers to make as freely as his. Wing Yi did not answer him immediately, and the street, for once, had the grace to wait rather than fill the silence with its own opinion, which she noticed and, in a private corner of herself, appreciated more than she let show. She thought of the auction block 6 weeks behind her, of her name misspelled on a torn scrap in the mud, of the fever nights and the hairpin and every quiet, unhurried kindness Josiah had shown her that had cost him nothing to withhold and everything, in this camp, to offer instead. She told him yes in English steady enough that no one in the crowd could later claim she hadn't understood the question, and added, for her own sake as much as his, one condition Boone wrote into the license himself before the ink on it was dry, that the paper would carry her true name, Lam Wing Yi, spelled correctly this time, with no camp nickname entered anywhere on the county's books ever again. Boone performed what ceremony a county sheriff was authorized to perform, right there on the claim office porch within the hour, unwilling, he said, to let one more night pass with the question of her standing unsettled, and half the camp who had come that morning, expecting a legal argument, stayed instead for a wedding none of them had planned to witness. Afterward, in the last of the daylight, Josiah brought out from his coat pocket the 4 torn quarters of the original contract, which he had kept, unexplained even to himself until that moment, folded inside an old tobacco tin since the night he'd torn it apart in this same street, and Wing Yi laid them out on the counter beside the new marriage license the way Pruitt had once laid her worth, beside a column of gold dust figures. Only this time, the arrangement told a different story entirely. She set the jade hairpin down between the 2 papers, Plum Blossom catching the last light, the object with no price now resting between the paper that had once priced her and the paper that finally did not. And Tobias, watching from the edge of the porch with his mother's hand in his, asked in the blunt, unfiltered way of children why she was crying if the story had a happy ending, and Wing Yi, wiping her face with the back of one hand, told him that, in her country, the 2 were not opposites, and that he would understand the better the older he got. By the following autumn, a full year on from the day the stage first climbed into Widow's Bar, trailing dust and a debt she had never chosen, the small shelf of dried herbs Wing Yi had once kept hidden beneath a false trunk bottom had become a fixture the whole camp knew to knock for. A lean-to built onto the side of the cabin, with her own hands and Amos's carpentry. Packets of ginger and mugwort and a dozen other roots labeled now, in her own careful brush strokes, alongside the English words Tobias had helped her learn to write beneath them. Doc Cobb sent patients to her directly these days, rather than around her, and more than once the 2 of them had sat up together, comparing what each tradition knew about a fever or a wound, arguing amiably over a shared cup of coffee in a way neither of them could have imagined the winter the fever first came through. Her English had lost most of its careful hesitation, though she kept, deliberately, the habit of choosing words slowly because she had learned that a woman who spoke with weight was heard differently than a woman who spoke merely to fill silence. And Josiah, who had grown considerably more talkative himself over the year in ways Amos teased him about at every opportunity, said more than once that he'd married the only person in the territory more patient than the mountains themselves. Hetty Reed had become, against all early odds, something close to a friend. The 2 women trading remedies and complaints about the same cold wind over the same washing line most mornings. And Tobias, 12 now and forever unable to sit still, had taken to calling Wing Yi Su Jie when he wanted something, and Ah Jie, older sister, when he simply wanted to sit near her, a small linguistic gift that touched her more than she ever managed to explain to him fully. Cutter still didn't speak to her if he could help it, and there remained, she knew, corners of Widow's Bar that would never fully unclench around a woman who had arrived on an auction block. But the corners had gotten smaller every season, worn down not by any single dramatic act, but by a year of steady, visible work that the camp, whatever its old suspicions, could no longer pretend not to need. On the shelf above the herb lean-to, in a plain wooden frame Josiah had built her without being asked, hung the 4 torn quarters of the old contract beside the marriage license and the jade hairpin, not hidden this time, but displayed in plain sight of anyone who walked the path to her door. A record, she liked to think, of exactly how far a paper's meaning could travel if enough people decided to change it. If you had stood in that street the night Widow's Bar auctioned a woman like cattle and watched one quiet man tear the only paper that supposedly gave him any claim to her at all, what would you have believed came next? That tearing a thing apart could ever be enough to fix what it had broken, or that some debts once paid honestly and in full simply stopped needing the paper to prove they were ever settled. Lam Wing Yi never forgot the ledger where her worth was once written beside a week's gold dust. And she never fully forgave the camp that let it happen, but she built, in the wreckage of that first cruel afternoon, something Widow's Bar had not known it needed until she gave it anyway. A shelf of remedies, a marriage chosen rather than imposed, a name spelled correctly at last on every page that mattered. The mountains that had looked down indifferently on her arrival looked down, a year later, on a woman the whole camp now walked a mile out of its way to ask for help. And if there is a harder kind of victory than earning back your own freedom after a stranger's kindness bought it, it is building afterward a life so undeniably yours that nobody in the county dares write a price beside it ever again. On winter evenings now, when the wind comes down off the Sierra the way it did the night Amos's fever finally broke, Wing Yi still takes the jade hairpin from its frame sometimes. Not because she needs the reminder anymore, but because some objects earn the right to be touched simply for what they survived alongside you. Tell me in the comments what you think that torn contract meant to Josiah the day he finally framed it beside her marriage license. A scar he wanted to remember, or a promise he never wanted her to doubt again. And if a story about paper and what it truly costs to be free of it found something honest in you tonight, subscribe, because Gamsang kept more women like Wing Yi than the history books ever bothered to write down, and their stories are only now getting told the way they deserve to be told the first time.